So for those of you that are new, this is part 3 of a 7-part series entitled A Brief History of the Western Religious Tradition and its Sacred Texts, or What Every Christian Ought to Know About the Bible But Usually Doesn't. The last time, 2 Sundays ago, for part 2, the congregation and I engaged in a deep dive into the 2 different creation stories that are contained in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and the 2 different flood stories in Genesis 6, 7, and 8, which were written about 400 years apart. Today, so continuing on with the lessons drawn from the last sermon. So the Hebrew Bible scholars call the first 11 books of Genesis the primeval history. And so we've been looking at that. But we've also learned that there were much older creation and flood stories that the ancient Israelite writers of the J&P creation flood myths, likely in the words of Michael Coogan, adopted, adapted, and sometimes rejected, that were in circulation in the rest of the Near East. These stories being anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 years older than the stories contained in Genesis. For example, in both the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis, humans were created to do the labor that these most human gods had been doing for themselves. Humans would now build houses for their gods, called temples, and grow and prepare their food, called sacrifices, creating for the gods a new life of ease. In this regime, humans were essentially slaves for the gods, who personified the powers that control the cosmos. These gods, however, in contrast to the gods that would eventually be imagined, are surprisingly fragile and even weak. They have to eat to survive, and prior to the creation of humans, they had to produce their own food. They were easily disturbed by the noisy humans that they made, which prevented them from getting their required sleep. The primary distinction between the humans and the gods in the Mesopotamian myths is that humans are mortal, though the post-flood status of humans in the Atrahasis narrative is ambiguous. This fragility has echoes in the older Genesis 2 Adam and Eve story. Unlike Elohim in Genesis 1, here Yahweh is, again quoting Coogan, down to earth, immanent, and described in vividly anthropomorphic detail, as if he were a human. Yahweh is depicted as avoiding the sun and only coming out in the cool of the evening. In the whole story of chapter 3, the only substantial difference between humans and Yahweh and other members of the divine assembly was humanity's lack of knowledge about good and evil. Both the gods and humanity were immortal. Once humans obtained knowledge, they were, according to Genesis 3:22, like the gods. Hence, to divest humanity of their new godly station, they had to be denied immortality by blocking access to the tree of life. Similar to the way Gilgamesh had been robbed of immortality by a snake, the humans are tricked out of it by a serpent that is then reduced to a snake as a punishment. Hebrew Bible scholar Robert Kawashima, who I had the honor of being his teaching assistant twice while he was teaching Hebrew scriptures, illustrates these comparisons between the gods and humans this way. Davina, is there a chart for us? There we go. So we see, let's move down the list. So gods have both knowledge and they're immortal. Humans, pre-transgression, they're immortal, but they have no knowledge. Humans, post-transgression, have knowledge and are immortal, just like the gods. Humans, post-Eden, though, where they've been barred from the tree of life, have knowledge, but are no longer immortal. And then all of the rest of the animals have no knowledge and were never immortal. So then in the later priestly creation story in Genesis 1, written about 400 years after the Adam and Eve Garden of Eden story, humans are now imagined as the rulers of all that exists on the earth, who are created in the image of God, and who have been expressly given dominion, in the language of Genesis 1, dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, and commanded to be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. Likely written during the Israelites' period of Babylonian captivity, the priestly writers rejected the model of reality contained in the Mesopotamian creation myths, like Enuma Elish and Atrahasis, and in a new feat of metaphysical imagination, gave both Elohim and humanity a big promotion. In this story, the deity is often singular, though it is still inconsistently sometimes spoken of in the plural. Let us make humans in our image, showing the continuing influence of the idea of the divine assembly and the polytheism in other Mesopotamian myths. But the new deity has sufficient power to speak the created order into existence, an idea the priestly writers likely borrowed from the Memphis theology of creation in ancient Egyptian religion. With these innovations, we can see that the ancient Israelite writers created a distinctive three-tiered created order. At the top, a single overarching deity, followed closely next in line by humans who are just a little lower than the deity, as depicted in Psalms 8, and then all the rest of creation. Ancient Israelites thereby produced the first enduring monotheism and a conception of humans as destined for dominion and rule over non-human creation. The difference, however, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, between Israelite monotheism and pagan religions of that era was not simply a matter of arithmetic, one God rather than many. Instead, the pagan religions had personified nature's forces and had ascribed a will to them and called them gods. But Israel's new monotheism, for the first time in human history, conceived of a God who was completely outside of nature, who through omnipotent power controlled the now desacralized forces of nature. As we will see in future installments, this concept of human superiority to and dominion over the rest of non-human nature was decisively carried forward into early Christianity by the church father, missionary, and theologian Paul of Tarsus. In his epistle to the Romans, a book included in the Christian New Testament, Paul declared that God had abandoned pagans because they worshiped and served creation rather than the Creator, thereby incorporating into early Christianity the Jewish idea of this absolute separation between God and the natural created order, meaning that to venerate nature was to engage in idolatry. Significantly, this passage is one of the most cited whenever conservative Protestant Christians discuss human responsibility or lack thereof for the environment. And it is why the famed Protestant theologian Paul Tillich declared that within Christianity, the term pantheist is a heresy label of the worst sort. The ancient Israelites had two more major contributions to make in terms of metaphysical innovation. In the 4th century BC, Alexander's army brought Greek culture to the Middle East, creating a variety of tensions amongst the ancient Israelites. A low point was Antiochus IV's Epiphanes' attempt to destroy Judaism in and around about 165 BCE, which had two major effects. First, it led to the Maccabean revolt, and then to the period of independence of nearly a century that is often remembered as a golden age within ancient Israel. Second, prior to that victory, many who refused to abandon the religious practices of their Jewish ancestors experienced harsh persecution and executions. The stories of these martyrs are enshrined in chapters 6 and 7 of 2nd Maccabees, part of the Apocrypha contained in some Bibles. The experience of large-scale martyrdom had a profound impact on Israel's understanding of God. The execution of those faithful to the God of Israel produced a theological trauma and dilemma. Past Israelite travails had been explained in terms of the people's unfaithfulness to the demands of Yahweh. In the present persecution, the martyrs were put to death precisely because they remained faithful to God. What then could be said of God's faithfulness? One response was the rise of apocalyptic literature, which posited that in the near future, God would restore his people and be faithful to his promises. Another was the emergence of the belief that those righteous martyrs would be raised up. Until this period, Israel had developed no notion of an afterlife, at least not an afterlife anyone would desire. The realm of the dead, or Sheol, was a fuzzy idea, not quite a full extinguishing, but also not anything to look forward to. A human lived a predictable span of life and then was no more. This assumption, however, became intolerable in the face of horrible deaths of righteous people who were executed precisely for their righteousness. The solution was that in the future, God would raise them up from the very dust into everlasting life as a reward for righteousness. We see an example of this in the book of Daniel, the last book written that was included in the canon of the Hebrew Bible. The last chapter of Daniel declares that, quotes, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." The proof that God could raise them up from nothingness was that God had created the world out of nothing. In 2nd Maccabees, a mother encourages her sons to persevere as they were being tortured to death, and she does so in these words. "I carried you 9 months in my womb and nursed you for 3 years, and I have reared you and brought you up to this point in your life, and have taken care of you. I beg you, my child, to look at the heaven and the earth and see everything that is in them, and recognize that God did not make them out of things that existed. And in the same way, the human race came into being. Do not fear this butcher, but prove worthy of your brothers. Accept death, so that in God's mercy you may get back again with your brothers." The statement that God did not make them out of things that existed marks the first occurrence in Judaism of the notion of creation out of nothing, or as metaphysicians would say, creation ex nihilo. Creation from nothing solves the problem of how God will rise up the martyr if there is nothing left of the martyr's body. If God can create the universe from nothing, we can raise up the martyr from nothing. The idea of creation from nothing thus comes into ancient Judaism, not through philosophical speculation on the nature of God, but to solve the challenge that martyrdom posed to the belief in God's faithfulness. Now a bodily afterlife is conceived, and it is the divine power of creation ex nihilo that makes this possible. Having thus conceived this innovation, this power of creation out of nothing gets read back into the Genesis creation stories, even though it does not exist in those original creation stories, as we explored so intensely 2 weeks ago. As noted above, another major innovation was this turn towards apocalypticism. The book of Daniel, in addition to introducing the idea of future resurrection to life as a reward for the faithful, introduced a genre of literature making detailed predictions when this reward might arrive. Indeed, it is because of the detailed predictions contained in Daniel in the Hebrew Bible that scholars are so confident in their opinion about when Daniel was written. Scholars examine where the writers, quotes, get the history right, and where the material suddenly ceases to correspond to actual history. In the book of Daniel, that happens in chapter 11, verses 35 and 36. Through verse 35, the history described tracks with what is otherwise known about the conflicts between the Seleucids and the Egyptians. Then the description, particularly as it relates to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, stops tracking actual history known from other sources. At a minimum, this is when this material must have been written. The anonymous author in writing this tale of what Coogan calls heroic fiction had up to this point been narrating history that had already occurred. After this, he was writing hopeful speculation about what was about to happen in the near future as an attempted encouragement to a community experiencing persecution. As will become apparent, this apocalyptic mentality, as Dale B. Martin calls it, is carried forward in a big way into movements that formed in the wake of the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, and would eventually become early Christianity. Indeed, it is hard to imagine that the Christian New Testament's final book of Revelation would have been written had Daniel not preceded it. With this, I will conclude this brief walk through the Hebrew Bible, known to Christians as the Old Testament. There is much more to explore there, but this will serve to demonstrate that these texts were not written out of whole cloth. They emerged in an evolving cultural and political context and served the interests of the writers in their time and place. In my next installment, we will begin to see that the same is true of the New Testament. And I think that this is a good place to think about. I suggested to Christopher that my theme for today is Through a Glass Darkly, which is, the Apostle Paul's famous passage. Up until, the last 100 years of biblical research, we've looked at the Bible through a glass darkly. But emerging archaeology finds, new texts that have finally been recovered, that have been lost for thousands of years, are starting to shed a light on the biblical narratives and allowing us now to recover what they meant in the original setting. So what does that mean for any Christian community, but particularly for this Christian community? That seems like it's worth a few minutes of conversation. Let me frame maybe our sharing with this little anecdote. I participated for about 10 years in a theology discussion group at an Episcopal congregation. And so it wasn't really a Bible study, it was reading kind of the newest cutting edge theologians. And it was led by this retired woman who periodically would find some of kind of the same material I'm talking about here, take it to the parish priest and say, oh man, look what we're finding. And the priest would poo-poo her and say, oh, we've known about that for 70 years. And she says, well, then why doesn't it ever show up in any of your sermons? Oh, you couldn't handle that. Maybe you could handle it. Most of the people sitting in the pews, they could not handle that at all. That is not why they come to church. Now, I know that, we have at least 3 people, Cameron and Jody and Christopher, that have seminary training. Some of it in conservative evangelical settings. But even in that setting, Christopher, you've said some of this stuff creeps in there as well. And certainly in mainline Protestant and Catholic seminaries, there's nothing especially radical about anything I've said. What is radical is talking about it in a Sunday service. That is unusual. But this is Greater Purpose Community Church, and we do that. So anyway, in your conversations, what were your thoughts about how a deeper understanding of the historical context of these texts that we claim to revere affects us? Someone want to share anything?
I think it's particularly frustrating for me as a parent that conservative theology has such a massive influence in the educational system. One is a person that grew up in a red state where I never attended, because I wasn't forced to attend conversations about evolution. I had the option to opt out of those conversations, or the teacher had the option to teach it for a day.
Right.
Teaching it for a day, that meant that they told us to open the book and read it, and there was no test or quiz on it. It was just a 24-hour requirement.
Right.
So for me, I think the question is if we know that this Reformed theology that's had so much influence over our educational system is erroneous, then why are we still letting children opt out of these conversations about scientific facts?
Right.
And because as a result, we've got people that are becoming adults that are voting that are stifling progress, and that's a problem.
Speaking of evolution, it reminds me of I delivered a paper on evangelical Christianity and their attitudes about the environment and climate change. It was over at Santa Clara University, and amongst my listeners was this professor who at that point was at Utah State in Utah, but he had been a biology professor at Mercer University down in Georgia. And Mercer, I'm told, is, it's a Baptist university, but it's, by Baptist standards, kind of moderate. Is the way that, he described it. He says that he was nonetheless tasked with teaching evolutionary science to a bunch of folks that had chosen to come to, a Baptist university. And so he would begin on his very first day of class and he'd say, how many of you here believe in evolution? Nobody puts up their hands. Nobody puts up their hands. Okay. How many of you have read Darwin's Origin of the Species? No one. No one had read it. And he says, so he'd say, so I'm going to infer that your non-belief in evolution isn't because of your own personal study, deeply investigating evolutionary science. And they all go, yeah, that's true. We haven't actually studied evolution. And so you're getting your opinions about evolution from someone else. Maybe your parents, maybe your pastors. And they say, yeah, that's where we get our ideas. And you say, so, and how many of them that you're getting your ideas, how many of them do you think have read Darwin's Origin of the Species? And the kids were all quite clear that, they were pretty sure they hadn't read it either. And so then his punchline as a biology professor was, I'm not here to convince you to believe in evolution. I'm only here to teach you exactly what it is that you don't believe in. And then he would give us, proceed for a semester-long course in evolutionary biology. I think, I've certainly encountered plenty of folks that are sure it's false, but don't know anything about it. I know a lot of people think it's true and still don't know anything about it. So, anyway. But so that's one of the things, is that there is this real effort to conceal information that is present not just in evangelical churches. If we went up the street to a Presbyterian service, this would be a very radical sermon as well. Any other things to share?
You're saying that it's like many priests will say you can't take, and including Chris, where he says you can't take the Bible literally. But they'll say they didn't know modern science, so they used what they knew to explain what they didn't.
Right.
And as time goes by, you have different tools, you're learning more to be able to explain this. You can't just say it's concrete. You have to be open to exploring new ideas and new thoughts and new theories and everything.
Right. It's often I think there's this notion, certainly within the conservative wings of American Christianity, that if we could recreate Paul and Peter and Jesus out of nothing and bring them into 2019 and give them a crash course of the last 500 years of scientific revelation, there's kind of an assumption they'd still believe everything they believed. I think it's quite possible they'd all go, wow, that's really cool. I wish I had known that 2,000 years ago. It would have affected what I wrote. So at any rate, I think that there is this assumption that, these old founders of the religion would insist on staying wedded. They didn't know they were writing scripture, for one thing. That didn't happen for another 400 years. Others, yeah.
I was curious about, at least growing up within an evangelical environment, having, like, as you were mentioning, Genesis 1 and 2, it sounded like Genesis 2 is written way prior to Genesis 3.
Right.
And at the time of, like, the Hebrew compilation, when they were grouping things together, did they intentionally group it in a way to create a narrative thing as opposed to a, because we take it evangelical and take it as it was written by Moses, the first
Right.
5 books, all those things. So at what point was there kind of the conflation of all the information, and was there an agenda to it?
Well, and that is still much debated. How did it, let's just look at the first 5 books, the Torah. How did it come together in that form and why? One of the hypotheses out there is that when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and hauled the elites back to Babylon to be in exile, is that they were seeking the opportunity to have a text, to continue their religious practices. And that, maybe Nebuchadnezzar himself or one of his functionaries said, well, show me your text. What is your sacred literature? And that in that setting of exile, that they sliced and diced the various separate narratives. At that point, it would have been, 3 narratives and some new stuff thrown in. So the Deuteronomist, the Elohist, and the Yahwist, all their material had already been written. But, each of those writers appealed to a certain segment of the Jewish community. And so in creating the Torah, it was kind of like, well, I have to create this document that, for those members that really like the Yahwist and his stories, and really like the Elohist and his stories, and those that really like that book-long, speech by Moses in Deuteronomy, and put them together in something. Well, they'll be able to read it, and they'll be able to say, "Oh yeah, there's my stuff. This is the stuff I like." So that is one of the theories of how it might have come together. There is another very widespread within the scholarly community is, the Hebrew Bible as we have it is mostly the product of Ezra, who was a priest in Jerusalem. He's called the redactor, the great redactor, who puts the book together once they get back from exile and are creating this exclusively monotheistic religion. Prior to that, Israelite religion would still have very heavy influence of polytheism in it. And so the robust monotheism that we think about today, associated with Judaism and then, Christianity with the strange wrinkle of the Trinity, is, put together by Ezra, perhaps. He's probably the big, your specific question is, if you're looking at it for one person, it might have been Ezra. Other questions or just comments? Jason?
One of the things that I kind of also brought up with was the dogma presented by the church I went to. I was told that I had to think a certain way and adopting certain thoughts on one hand, and then my journey with Christ and God is supposed to be my own and as unique to me. And so at one point I was thinking, I had this strange thought, the verse John 3:16, believe in him. And I interpreted it differently. It said, it didn't say believe it like he did. He got nailed to the cross and died for our sins. Why on earth would we follow a legal contract? That requires you to be aware of it and believe in it. So therefore, it's infallible, but believing in a man who did great things, what did he believe in? That takes a completely different idea on the story and on why I was supposed to believe. And when I asked people on my church about this, everyone got upset. We are deviating from the baseline church.
Right. Well, we'll be covering that in future installments as we move on into the New Testament. But you have put your finger on exactly the huge divide within American Christianity. Evangelicals are John 3:16 Christians.
Oh, yeah.
They're not really very fond of Matthew 25:31 through 46. That's if you do it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you do it to me. There, being a faithful Christian is all about what you're doing and has literally nothing to do with what you believe. But we'll be looking at that, and it's beginning to look at it in installment 4.
So that was a lot. But the problem with the church is for so long, these conversations haven't happened, even in progressive circles. And one thing that we were committed to when 3 of our leaders that were young leaders at the conception stage of this church was, we want to be a church that embraces science and embraces history, because that is not something that's done very often in the church. So we're committed to knowledge. And the issue that I have with much of the American church is a lot of them, and I will say I'm greatly impressed with their ability to memorize scripture, so they know exactly what the Bible says, probably more so than I do. but they can't really tell you what it means. And that's a problem. It's a problem that honestly bleeds into every facet of our society, because the majority of Americans are still Christian, and they take those beliefs about science and the world and they take them to voting booths. And I think that's why we have the sad state of a country that we have. But the Bible, in reality, it evolves in knowledge. I mean, if you look at the beginning in Genesis, it starts with a garden, it ends with a city. If you look at some of the narratives about God in the Old Testament, God is kind of wrathful and spiteful and intolerant of any small defect. But by the time you get to the gospel, you see a God of love that loves the world so much that God, according to the authors of the Gospels, would lay down his life. The Bible is an evolving story. And I think the challenge for all of us today is to encourage the church to be an evolving church, because it's desperately overdue. And I think the fruits of the fear of knowledge are evident, especially in regards to evolution. And Bernie brought up today how a lot of the church views themselves as rulers of this earth and how they have dominion over the earth, and animals are just, basically furniture with legs. That's a problem. Koala bears this week are functionally extinct. I don't know if you knew that or not. 60% of big fish in the ocean have died in the last 15 years. The last known Sumatran rhino died this week. In my lifetime, I've seen black rhinos go from endangered to extinct. Polar bears are starving to death. The ice caps are shrinking. They literally are losing their hunting grounds. They're starving. They're nothing but skin and bones. And meanwhile, the church is uninterested in addressing this problem. If there is any group of people in this country that should be on the front damn lines of signing the Green New Deal, it's the church, and yet we are silent, and it's bullshit, and we need to call this out. I want us, as a community, to commit to restoring our Blue Boat home. I want us to commit to embracing science and not to be scared of it, not to be afraid of new knowledge. I mean, how often is it, like Jason was talking about, that you bring a new perspective into faith communities and you're shut down immediately because people are scared that you're being heretical? Enough is enough. If you haven't seen the show His Dark Materials, I encourage you to do so. I'm always encouraging you to watch nerd shit. But especially this one, because it fits the ethos of the church. I'm going to spoil a little bit of the story for you. The villain in His Dark Materials is the church. They suppress knowledge to oppress people. And we were talking about what was the motivation for consolidating scripture and getting people on the same page. My personal theory, that I think Dale Martin actually shares this theory, is that when you can get people to believe the same things, it's very easy to maintain control. Because you can use these beliefs that are all, for intents and purposes, the exact same to maintain control and to keep questions from harming your influence in society. I think that's what the church has done over the years. And I think the most powerful tool that we have as a community is questions. The two most powerful words that you will ever wield in society are what if. I want you to fabricate them often. I want you to wield them wisely and use them to tear the system down that literally has us a decade away from a global tragedy. And until next week, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you through the wilderness and protect you through the storms. May it bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that it shows you. And may it bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Grace and peace to you.